what I'm hoping to do today, if you're not already bought into this, what I'm aiming to do today is to really highlight how the business analysis role is strategic, and how actually getting BAs involved earlier in the project lifecycle is really crucial. And I'm going to share some techniques that I've found useful. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with some of those techniques, but it may be a bit of a refresher as well. And my presentation has two main parts, built around three good BA questions. So I'm going to start by talking about why strategy is so important. And I hazard a guess that we're probably all on a similar page here, but we'll reflect on it. And I'm going to talk about a historic case study, perhaps from a different angle than you might have heard before. Then, in the second part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about what strategy is. And there are many great definitions out there, but there's one in particular that really resonated with me and some colleagues when we came across it. So I'm going to share that definition with you, and also talk about how we might play with strategy, how we might align with strategies as BAs. And there'll be a whistle-stop tour through a number of techniques, so a very thin slice. If you do want to know more about any of those techniques, please just email me, tweet me, and I've got tons of stuff I can send you. But I want to start by transporting you back in time. And if you will, sort of come with me. If you imagine that now that we're back in 1912, and it's the April the 15th, 1912, and we're observing the North Atlantic Ocean about 400 miles from Newfoundland, and something of historic tragic event was about to occur. So I'm going to need a little bit of audience participation for this bit. Shout out if a historic event comes to mind. What do you think happened on the 15th of April 1912? Yes, well, oh, that was really clear. Awesome. The technology works. Yeah, absolutely. And if I asked you what the reason the Titanic sank was, what would your gut reaction to that be? So I think I heard iceberg, and of course, yeah, absolutely right. The Titanic sank because it hit an iceberg. But what if I were to tell you that actually there's more to the Titanic story than the iceberg? And actually, if we look at that case study with a business analysis hat on, there's a strong argument that says that there was a range of strategic disconnects. And actually, it could be argued that the Titanic was doomed to fail before it even left the shipyard, before the requirements were even complete, because there was a strategic wrangling, disconnect over what the Titanic was for, what its core purpose was. You see, it turns out that a number of design compromises were made. Now, I mean, the Titanic's a fascinating case study. It's entered our collective consciousness through myth and mystery and film and folklore. But what we probably all remember about the Titanic, if you've heard the story, is that it was marketed as the unsinkable ship. And you would think that with an unthinkable ship, one of the biggest priorities would have been safety. And certainly at the design phase, that was where a lot of the design started. And again, if you've read or heard about the Titanic, you're probably aware that one of the Titanic's biggest safety features was that it was compartmentalized. So it had 16 watertight compartments going across the ship. And what that meant was, if the hull was breached, only one compartment would flood, and actually it was engineered so that 2 or 3 compartments could flood, and the liner would still stay afloat. Trouble was, while on the one hand there was this real desire for safety, On the other hand, there was this competing worldview that the Titanic had to be luxurious. Now, in 1912, travel was, was a much richer, more expensive experience than it would be today, and there were going to be millionaires on board the Titanic's maiden voyage, and and $1 million, £1 million is a lot of money today. So back then, it must have been an unimaginable sum. And millionaires would be expecting an experience that's opulent and luxurious, like we probably can't imagine. And one of the things, a design compromise that was made, was for a long, luxurious ballroom to be introduced. And this ballroom spanned multiple of these segmented compartments. And what that meant was one of the Titanic's primary safety features, the fact that it could hold water in watertight compartments, had been nibbled away. The ballroom spanned many of them; they didn't reach the top, meaning that if water were to get through the hull, it could spread into adjacent compartments. So there was that clash of worldview. Was it about safety? Was it about luxury? Or was it going to pull itself, organisationally, was it going to pull itself apart? Not only that, it certainly appears that there may have been some pressure on cost. More recent dives and exploration have found some interesting conclusions based on chemical analysis of some of the components. It turns out in 1912, the rivets and bolts that held the Titanic together would have all been handmade. And they were handmade, individually crafted out of iron. Recent analysis has shown that the iron that was used was really bad. It was really poor standard, lots of imperfections. And it turns out the thing that happens with poor quality iron is when you hit it, it shatters. See, we've now got a situation where the design, the key safety feature has sort of been designed away through that need for luxury, and perhaps through a desire to save costs. The very thing holding those watertight compartments together is brittle and will shatter upon impact. Not only that, it's been suggested that there was a pressure for on-time arrival. The real irony was, cruel irony, that they cancelled the lifeboat drills to practice an evacuation in Southampton, probably because they were so confident about the unsinkableness of the ship. But also it's recorded that the Titanic was going very fast through treacherous waters, certainly far faster than would have been considered safe at the time. But probably most astonishing is that the Titanic warned about the ice. In actual fact, the Titanic had one of the most technically sophisticated radio telegraphy systems of its era. It could hear, relay, and respond to messages from many other ships in the local area. And when it was in range of land, it could get messages back to the land as well. But again, there was a kind of clash of worldviews over what that communication technology was for. It wasn't operated by the White Star Line that ran the Titanic. It was operated by Marconi, a private company that provided telegraphy engineers. And they had conflicting priorities, because on the one hand, they were looking to get warnings to the bridge so that the captain could read about them. But on the other hand, another part of their job was relaying commercial traffic. And it turns out that in 1912, if you were a millionaire on board a cruise ship, a quite common hobby was to send telegrams to friends and family back home, presumably saying how wonderful the ballroom was and how nice the food was or whatever. And no fewer than six warning messages were received in the 24 hours leading up to those tragic and fateful events in 1912. But it's been suggested that not all 6 got to the captain. the really cruel irony, the final message that the Titanic would have received gave it specific coordinates about where the ice field was that eventually sank it. And the radio operator responded saying, "You're jamming me, stop transmitting," because he was desperately trying to get some telegrams back to land, commercial traffic, before the land went out of range. And what this exposes, and it's a, it's a historic case study, it's a different angle, but one of the things it exposes is that if an organization or a ship or anything, if there are different implied missions, then disaster can really be waiting in the wings. And I know what you're thinking. You're probably sitting there thinking that that's a really interesting historic story, but we don't work on ships. Or maybe you do, but probably not many of us work on ships. And we certainly don't work on the Titanic, although we've probably all been on our fair share of projects that feel like the Titanic. But we probably all worked in situations where there has been a pressure to make compromises, design compromises on the very projects that we're working on. We've almost certainly worked on projects where there's been a pressure on cost, a pressure for on-time arrival, and I'm sure we've all worked on projects where warnings have been ignored. So there's a parallel in the business world or the organizational world. And if there isn't that underlying cohesion, if there isn't that clear purpose of why an organization exists, we'll get that clash of worldviews so often, and it'll affect our projects. And it's like every single decision will be slow and ponderous. Do we go left? Do we go right? And our organizations will be at risk of hitting their own organizational icebergs. Threats out there in the external business environment that are totally predictable, but seem to be ignored. So that's one example, one reason of why we might want to be interested in strategy as business analysts within our organisation to avoid those organisational icebergs. I'm going to talk a little bit now about what strategy is and how we might play with it as BAs. And I wanted to start by sharing a formal definition. There are many definitions of strategy out there. Famously, Michael Porter has written a lot about competitive strategy, but the definition that myself and some colleagues came across a few years ago that we really liked, mainly due to its real clarity, is from a 2011 book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. I can never pronounce the author's name. I think it's Rummelt. And it's a great book. If you want a really practical book about strategy, get a copy of that book. But Rummelt describes strategy as a cohesive response to an important challenge. And as BAs, we could have a good debate around that definition. We could ask whether there's always a challenge. But I think what's really important is that cohesiveness. There's a whole coordinated set of actions that the organisation is pushing in one direction, and that our projects and programmes and portfolios all feed into that. He goes on to say that unlike a standalone decisional goal, a strategy is a coherent set of analyses, concepts, policies, arguments and actions that respond to a high stakes challenge. And when you start to wrap that definition, you think, well, analyses, that's kind of what we do as BAs. Concepts, where we develop all sorts of concept models. Policies, we get involved with business rules and policies. Arguments, all of these things. It's starting to really feel like it's really hooked into what we do as BAs. And clearly, if there isn't that underlying vision mission, then the organisation might pull itself apart. Now, before we go on, and I talk about a few models, I wanted to give another smaller example of what can happen when strategy is unclear. Because clearly there are Titanic type tragedies and massive organisational failures. But if strategy isn't clear, you get smaller, lots of smaller but significant problems. And in my day job, I do a lot of facilitation, and a while back I was facilitating a meeting for a client, and I had a common problem where I could get all of the stakeholders' time, a common time with them, but the client didn't have a meeting room available at that same time. So I did what I suspect many of us may do in that situation. I hired a meeting room for the 3 days in a local hotel. And I won't tell you which brand of hotel it was, but it's an international brand that you'd undoubtedly recognise. And if you were to look at their global mission vision, it would be something about excellent customer service and making people feel at home. And I rocked up to the hotel on the first day. I went to reception, and I was greeted by the most enthusiastic reception I have ever met in my life. And it was a raining, dreary morning, so this was really welcome. And she was great. She showed me to the meeting room that I had booked for 3 days. It was a 3-day meeting. She gave me the keys. She made sure the projector was working. And I asked the receptionist, can I keep these keys? Because, you know, it's quite a controversial, confidential meeting. We'd really like to leave some flip charts there. And she was like, you know, sure, Adrian, really keep the keys. All that we ask is, tomorrow, when you come in, could you just let reception know that you're here, so we know you're in the building? And I was like, okay, fine. So first day of the workshop happens, and it goes really well. The stakeholders leave. I'm writing up until, I don't know, 8 p.m. in the evening. I say goodbye to the receptionist on the way out. Next morning, I sort of rock up early again. I come to the reception, expecting to see my enthusiastic receptionist. And I'm greeted by a very different receptionist this time, who looked something like this. I'm not sure if you've ever seen that receptionist, or a receptionist like her. But first of all, what happened was like I was waiting, and the phone rang, and she answered it, and I thought, okay, well, I mean, I guess the phone's there. I mean, okay, And then anyway, once she'd finished the phone call, I explained, I said, oh, you know, morning, I'm back. I'm here for the second of the 3 days I've got the room booked for. I've already got the key, but I was told yesterday that I just needed to check in. So, you know, here I am. And the look on her face of complete disappointment and anger. And she explained to me, she said, no, you're not allowed to keep the key. In fact, she said, we have a process whereby we record everybody that tries to steal our keys, and your name is now on that list, and if you ever come to do business with this hotel again, we will not trust you with any one of our keys. And I was sitting there stunned. But I did what any good British person would do in that situation. And I don't know culturally how things are in South Africa, but in the UK, what we do in situations like that is we apologise. We apologise and start to feel slightly passive aggressive inside. It's a very British keep calm and carry on type of ethos. And anyway, so I was there feeling really weird about this whole key situation. And I don't really blame her. It's kind of interesting. I can't remember the exact words she used, but I can really remember how she made me feel. And those small moments of truth, I don't blame that receptionist. You know, it's probably that some middle manager somewhere was telling their staff, you know, we've got this ridiculous KPI about keys, so make sure you don't let them leave your site. And they were trying to save money on replacement keys or whatever. But in doing that, they were jeopardizing the whole customer experience and jeopardizing that clear link to providing good customer experience for the strategic goal. So you get those misalignments. And one of the key tools, or a key tool that we can use to try and and understand that alignment and how our projects fit to it is a good old tool, a good old technique called VMOST. And you may well have seen this before. In fact, calling this a technique is almost too grand. It's really just a useful acronym, a mnemonic. And VMOST stands for Vision, Mission, Objective, Strategy, Tactics. And the idea is at the sort of top of the hierarchy, the strategic hierarchy, organizations ought to have a vision and a mission. There's a lot of good debate in the business community about the difference between a vision and a mission. I mean, for what it's worth, my take on it is a mission is like a core purpose, and it probably doesn't change very often. A vision is an envisioned future state, somewhere that the organization is trying to get to. It might be very lofty, it might be long term, but it could change more frequently. And the thing is, these things need to be clear, concise, repeatable. They've really got to speak to people. People have really got to identify with them. But they're probably quite aspirational, quite woolly. So what organizations rightly do is define objectives which are more precise, they're specific, achievable, realistic, and they start to set the scene on the type of things that the organization values, the kind of things that it measures. But those objectives are achieved through normally a series of strategic themes, strategic pillars. They're normally quite broad, and where the rubber meets the road, as our US colleagues would say, are the tactics. And these are the individual actions, granular projects that need to happen in order to support that strategy. I mean, that might sound a bit abstract, so I'll talk through an example. An organisation that we're probably all familiar with, we know and love, is IIBA, and the International Institute for Business Analysis has a global core purpose and mission of uniting a community of business professionals to deliver better business outcomes. And that tells you a lot about what IIBA is aiming to do. It's bringing people like us together to share knowledge, and not just BAs, but within a bigger ecosystem. If you take the UK chapter as an example, well, we have a whole set of objectives. So we're running 24 events this year. We're running 9 virtual events. We're collaborating on the BA conference Europe, and those are measurable objectives. We're aiming for 1,000 members by the end of the year. But that doesn't tell us sort of how we're going to get there. So we have a number of strategic pillars beneath that. So, for example, to grow our membership, one of our strategic pillars is around collaborating with like-minded organisations. So in the UK, the BCS is a dominant player, so we collaborate, we can start to cross-pollinate, to run events, to be able to run so many events. We have a regional strategy with regional volunteers. And of course, there are tactics, there are projects that underpin all of that need to actually happen. So if you visualize this differently, if you visualize it as kind of like a rocket, and my PowerPoint skills, this was the closest I could get to a rocket on PowerPoint. So imagine this looks a bit more rockety. But if you imagine the vision and mission at the kind of nose cone, it's really setting direction. Then you've got the objectives beneath it, the strategic themes aligned to them, and then the thrusters and boosters, where the rocket fuel is being ignited, is in the tactics. And that's where our change portfolio sits. You know, every project that we work on really ought to be aligned to some sort of strategic theme. But I hazard a guess that not everyone here, and myself included, I'm sure we've all worked on some projects where that alignment isn't so clear. We might even have worked on some projects where it's kind of like a stakeholder said, I know what I want, I just want this system. And we have to work with them to understand why. So what really happens is often organizations are quite segmented into different silos. Maybe we've got sales and marketing, operations, customer service. And what organizations do is they put a portfolio of change across that, or what I tend to call a leaky bucket. It's kind of like change goes in there, and hopefully some of it will be delivered, but lots of it might leak away before it's delivered. And how does stuff get into that portfolio of change? Well, a number of reasons. Firstly, sometimes people say things like, it's a great idea. I always think 4 really dangerous words. You know, like when you come to work on a Monday and someone's waiting at your desk and they utter those 4 dangerous words, I've had an idea. And you know you're in for months of work. Or maybe a change gets in there because people say, why wouldn't we? You know those no-brainer ideas? I've always assumed they're called no-brainer ideas because no brain was involved in the decision. Or sometimes, like, we've chosen a vendor. Anyone ever had that? Where, like, you sort of, oh, well, we've decided we want XYZ system. The vendor's coming in tomorrow, so can you facilitate? And you're there thinking, I think we might have got this in the wrong order. Or the boss says, or our client wants, and the trump card. The trump card is, and we have a business case. And I'm not for one moment arguing against the need for business cases. All right, they're so important. They're really, really important. But I kind of feel we've bonded a little bit in this last, like, 15 minutes, half hour. So letting you into a secret, or a secret we'll probably all agree on, I think some business cases are a complete work of fiction. And that's probably the case some of the time. And, you know, and we've got a duty as BAs to point that out. Is the serious nature of that is actually, if we see a business case that's a complete work of fiction, we're really well aligned to show that. Ultimately, it's the sponsor's decision, but we can help her or him make an informed decision. If we don't, or if we're unable to, and if change gets progressed in this sort of segmented way, that's when the strategic divide starts to happen. You've got people on one side who are saying, well, we want these lofty goals like great customer service. But people on the other side of the divide who are saying things like, but we've got to make sure we save the money on printing new keys or whatever. And the two get disconnected in that middle layer. And one of the places that disconnect can happen is on the very projects and programs that we as BAs work on. So what can we do? The great news is there's a lot we can do, probably a lot that everyone in this room already does. That's one of the many cool things about being a BA. We really can move the needle in terms of organizational and strategic effectiveness. Before I share a few tools, techniques, a ponder point, a question, bringing back that nautical theme, is when you're thinking about strategy, or when we're thinking about strategy, it's worth thinking about what kind of ship you're on. And kind of bear with me with this analogy. So some of us might have the luxury of working on a cruise ship. I mean, not an actual cruise ship. I mean, if you do, you're really lucky. But what I mean is, like, if you think about a cruise ships generally sail in predictable waters. They have a roster of where they're departing from, where they're arriving. They probably don't sail in pirate-infested water, and it's probably relatively safe and predictable. And there might be some of us that work in business environments that are like that, where the business environment is quite slow to move, slow to adapt. And that allows a certain type of strategic planning to happen. You know, you can plan further out. But probably in reality, fewer and fewer of us are in that place. You know, even in conservative, what would have once been considered slow-moving industries, you know, there have been modern disruptive technologies, these sorts of things. And if you imagine a spectrum, if that's at one end of the spectrum, well, at the other end of the spectrum would be like, you know, like Christopher Columbus or an explorer who's kind of saying, you know, come on board, we're going to try and find, you know, America. Don't know how long it's going to take. We're just going to head off in the direction where we think it is. And that's a very different type of organization. And on the really extreme end would be a startup, where, you know, we've got an idea, but we're going to pivot. And we're going to pivot and change and adapt to the environment. And it's kind of worth thinking about where your organization on that spectrum. Is it, can it really know where it's going? Is the future knowable? Or is it pivoting? Or is it somewhere in between? Because the kind of strategic timelines are going to differ. So hold that thought in mind. When we think about strategy, kind of taking that definition of strategy that I projected earlier, and putting it into a diagram, because I know as BAs we all love a picture, or certainly I love a picture. Really, if you think about that definition, it's about taking a current state. The organisation is somewhere at the moment, but there's somewhere that it needs to get to, and the strategy, or many strategies, are ways of getting there. But then you think about what we do as BAs, and well, actually as BAs we take a current state, and normally the current state when we're speaking to stakeholders is really gloomy. It's like people tell us about all the problems with the systems and processes, and it's awful, and they tell us about the future state, and it's going to be sunny and it's amazing, and there's a silver bullet that's going to solve everything. And we talk about implementing change. But that change really is a change strategy. And one of the things that's really nice, for those of you that have been through the Business Analysis Body of Knowledge, the BA-BOK Guide version 3, if you haven't read it, it's a significant improvement, in my opinion, over version 2. One of the really nice things is that BA-BOK 3 acknowledges it and calls this a change strategy. So that whole, the industry is really gravitating towards business analysis as a strategic role. And of course, if we're helping align those change strategies to deliver them, then we're helping our organizations avoid that organizational iceberg. So in terms of strategic models, I've got a couple to share with you. Just a little story before I do that. You probably don't know, there's no reason why you would know, but I spent a year of my life growing up in Rochester, Minnesota, in one of the northern states of the United States of America. And this is actually a picture. If you were to zoom in, you can see a very young me boarding the school bus to Hoover Elementary School in this picture. And I was back in Minnesota with work, and I was really keen to get back to Rochester. I was in Minneapolis, the capital city, with work. It's quite a way away from Rochester, but I wanted to get back to see if my school was still there, to have a look at my old house and stuff like this. And if you've been to the US, you probably know it's really hard to get anywhere without a car. So I did what any responsible driver would do. I downloaded, because I've never driven in the US before, I downloaded a copy of the Minnesota driver's manual. And I kid you not, it's a fascinating read. Like seriously, if you've got 10 minutes, download it. You can get the PDF. It's fascinating. And I don't know about you, but I see business analysis everywhere. It's like I can't turn off the BA in me. And there was this mnemonic that leapt out at me when I was reading this driver's manual. And in the UK, when we're learning to drive, there's a mnemonic that gets drummed into us, which is MSM. MSM, I can still hear my driving instructor saying it, MSM, which is mirror, signal, maneuver. In Minnesota, they have SIPD, which stands for scan, identify, predict, decide, execute. And I was reading through this and I was thinking, that's a pretty good high-level strategic model. Because actually, if you think about it, what organizations and what we as BAs should help contribute to is organizations ought to be scanning their environment, looking for opportunities and threats, identifying the areas and the initiatives where they want to make a difference, predicting what the market's going to do to the extent that they can predict it, then deciding, and then executing. And when you think about strategic failures, it's almost like the failure happens somewhere between the P and the D. You know, sometimes what happens is people make decisions before doing the scan, identify, predict. And that's often the kind of, well, you know, well, we've seen this big shiny silver bullet, now go implement it. But if you think about that, you know, if you put that in the context of driving a car, that's a bit like making a decision before you look. And if you come to a busy junction and just think, I'm going to turn right, I won't look, probably not going to end well. But conversely, if you scan, identify, predict, but don't decide or execute, then that's akin to coming to a busy junction thinking, I need to brake now, but not actually applying the brakes. So that whole connection between the analysis and then the execution is so, so key. And that's potentially where some organizations and projects go wrong. So, I mean, I mentioned that in passing. A more formal way of talking about strategy analysis, and this is slightly adapted from BA Book version 3, is this one here. So we start by aligning whatever we're doing to the VMOST. It's so important as BAs, I certainly believe, in my opinion, so important that we're aware of our organization's vision mission so that we can align stuff. And the really cool thing is that if there isn't a mission, if there aren't objectives, if the strategy's unclear, we've got the skills to help our organizations define those things, if they'll let us. So if we can't align to it, maybe we can help facilitate and define it. And that's another way of elevating what we do within our organizations, raising the profile. But certainly we need to analyze the current state, define or predict where the organization wants to get to, analyze any gaps, make recommendations, and assess risk along the way. So I'm going to very, very briefly now, in the last kind of 15, 20 minutes, talk through a few techniques around this. That wrapper around the edge, the aligning to the VMOST, so important that when we get landed on a project, that we really think about how the projects that we've been being assigned align to the organisation strategy. And if they don't, then we've got the ability to call that out, you know, because maybe it's a project that needs changing or realigning. So keeping that VMOST in mind is pretty crucial. But thinking about assessing the current state, one technique, and again, calling this a technique is almost too grand, it's really just an acronym, is STEEPLE. And many of you may have seen similar techniques like PEST or PESTLE. STEEPLE is just a modern or a more recent variant. And STEEPLE stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, political, legal, and ethical. And the idea here is we take that holistic view at the business environment or the organizational environment that our ship is sailing in, that our organization is sailing in. And we start to say, well, what social changes are there? You know, maybe if we're a taxi company, the fact that people are more and more being comfortable with apps is a significant thing. Maybe the fact that there's an economic recession or boom or bust or whatever, maybe that affects the kind of projects that we're doing. In the UK, there was a really famous a company called Blockbuster Video, and it was a video rental shop, and it moved into DVD rental, and it eventually just went bankrupt because nobody was renting DVDs anymore. Everyone's streaming on Netflix and things like this. And you kind of think, actually, there's often a whole bunch of icebergs in our organizational environment. And it's like if we were BAs for Blockbuster Video and someone came across a project to say, well, what we should do is have a self-service checkout so people can rent their DVDs more easily. You might say, okay, we could do that, but actually if the propensity to even rent DVDs is decreasing, isn't that a bit like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic? So it's those kinds of conversations we can help nudge. You know, as BAs, we're rarely decision makers, but we can nudge. We can help nudge and help people make some informed decisions. Often when we're assessing the current state, we're looking for a root cause, a root problem, a technique, and this is a technique I personally love. Me and some colleagues use these all the time. Fishbone diagrams, sometimes known as cause and effect or Ishikawa diagrams, after Dr. Ishikawa that created them. And the idea here, you put sort of a supposed statement of problem on the head of the fish, and then you examine it from different angles. A common set of categories are the 4 Ps: policies, procedures, people, and plant or technology, so IT in our world. And you start to look at the first and second level contributing factors. So we might find that if the problem is, in this example, that 60% of customers abandon their application online and ring the call center, well, actually, perhaps a contributing factor to that is it's still a really complex process. It still requires a physical signature. And actually, you know, the IT isn't the root of the problem. It's a procedural problem, or you know, there's a legal constraint or something along those lines. So really useful technique. If you've not come across it before, there's lots of really good reading that I can send you on stuff like this, so just let me know. But one of a technique that it is so I find overwhelmingly useful is the problem statement. And one of the things that's great about a problem statement is its simplicity. So when we want to define where the organization wants to get to, we can do so in a concise and precise way. And there's no right or wrong way of writing a problem statement. This is a way. The problem of some kind of problem is affecting some stakeholders somewhere, the impact of which is some negative impact. A successful solution would deliver some positive outcomes. This is great, by the way, if you get that situation where someone comes to you with a solution and they're like, well, we just need to buy an app, or we just need to buy this system. Helping them take that step back, dodge that solution illusion. Because in these 4 sentences, what we're doing is establishing what problem we're trying to solve, thinking about the stakeholders who it's affecting, starting to get a sense of why this is a problem that we should address in the first place. You know, there are often many problems in organizations, but we need to put the emphasis where the strategy is and where the value is. And by defining the outcomes that the organization is wanting, we're starting to think about the benefits, how we know when that problem will be solved. So a mini example, putting that in context, if we imagine we were working for a taxi firm, and the owner of that taxi firm is really worried because they're seeing that they're disrupted by new channels and business models, you know, Uber and these sorts of things, and Lyft. Their booking and passenger numbers are dropping, and we have that typical situation. We come in on a Monday morning and there are those dangerous words uttered by an executive sponsor who says, I have an idea, we need an app. And we start to think, okay, well, you could have an app, but I'm not sure whether that's aligned to our strategy. So let's deconstruct it. Let's find out what problem you're trying to solve here. And maybe we find that actually the problem isn't a lack of an app. The problem is increased competition from new channels and competitors and substitutes like Uber, Lyft sharing, these kind of things. We try and find out who it impacts, and we find it's impacting drivers, but also our call center staff, contact center staff. Would have been easy to forget them, but you know, when it's busy, they're overrun. When it's quiet, they're bored. We start to think about the impact, and it's a reductions in bookings, which leads to underutilized cars, drivers. There's a real need to solve this problem. And we start to tap into what a successful outcome would look like. And a successful outcome would protect us from competitive forces and would allow us to retain and grow our customer base. So even in those 4 lines, we've dodged that solution illusion. We've started to encourage that stakeholder to think more strategically and align to their own strategy. And you can start to imagine a whole range of solutions. You know, an app might be one of them. But you know what? Moving out of the retail taxi market and into business taxi market might be another option, or executive hire or airport runs. We can then ensure that the organisation is making a decision that will really solve the problem, that will really move the needle in terms of organisational effectiveness. A small addition, if you write problem statements, it can be great to add 2 additional lines. And this is sort of colloquially known as a strategic alignment statement, but just add, this aligns with our stated strategy by, and would help us meet our objective of. Then what we're doing is we're starting a project, or even project, with a concise and precise definition of where we're trying to get to, the objectives, and also how it aligns to our strategy. And you can imagine building a business case out of this, and then our requirement cycle becomes easier because we've got that clear alignment. We can build on that further, and a great thing to do is to define the outcomes that we want, imagining that problem or opportunity statement like in the middle of a balanced business scorecard. And this is a traditional balanced business scorecard that's been around since the 80s. Kaplan Norton originally wrote about this thing, asking the question, well, financially, what will change when this problem's solved? Are we looking for increased revenue or avoided cost, or both? And initially we might not be able to put figures on that, but at least knowing, are our stakeholders expecting increased revenue, avoided costs, or something else? Are we all on the same page? That's a really valuable thing that a conversation we can create. What's important from a customer perspective? We might have a critical success factor of excellent customer service, but pinning a key performance indicator onto that, like 97% of customers recommend us, or whatever, or our complaints reduce. Internal processes, what do we need to excel at? If we're Amazon.com, we probably need world-class logistics, and that we might measure that by the number of orders we get out the door, or whatever. The final part of the traditional balanced business scorecard is traditionally learning and growth or innovation. I've bent that slightly to sustain. And what we're saying here is, how do we know that that problem stays solved? In the taxi example, you don't want a situation where it solves it for one competitor, but then the problem recurs the next week. So defining critical success factors and quantifiable key performance indicators helps ensure that everyone's on the same page over what we're trying to achieve. We also need to, moving through that strategic model, once we've got our problem statement, our outcomes defined, we also need to think about risk. We'll be doing this all through the project. I haven't got a huge amount to say here, other than I think as BAs, we're often perfectly positioned to spot risks that others can't see. And if we work in collaboration with our project management, our portfolio management, our program management colleagues, we can really make sure that the real impactful risks are dealt with. And there are many ways of cutting and deciding which risks to address. Often it's the high probability, high impact risks that we want to address the most. But it's worth making sure that we raise them and that our voice is heard. Of course, once we've done all this, when we know what the outcome, the objectives are, we can start to identify potential options. And like the great thing is there are often so many things that could change. We could change processes. We might be involved in projects that have no IT change at all. It's all process. Or it's facilities. It's moving from one location or building to another. Or there's an organizational structure change. Of course, technology is still key, is core, and I'm sure many of us work on technology projects, but there might even be changes to people in terms of skills, or even the proposition. We might be involved in projects that are tailoring a new proposition to a new channel or whatever. So to recap, just before we close, we've talked about strategy analysis for business analysis, and we've talked about aligning the projects, portfolios, programs to that VMOST. And the really cool thing being, if the objectives are missing, if the strategy is missing, maybe we can get our stakeholders to let us help them define it. So if we can't align, maybe we can define, and that enables us to really show even more value of the BA role. We analyse our current state, and we use techniques like STEEPLE for the external environment. For particular problems, we might use a fishbone diagram. We define or predict the future state. We might use a problem statement and critical success factors, KPIs, and the balanced business scorecard. That enables us to make some recommendations, and alongside all of this, we're assessing risk. All of that feeds really nicely into a business case, so that we can create compelling, consistent, coherent business cases that are not a work of fiction. In doing that, what we're doing is keeping that strategic compass, that crucial enabler, firmly in our focus, and gently nudging our stakeholders to keep it in their focus as well. And what that does is enable us to ensure that we avoid our own organisational icebergs. As a final ponder point, this genuinely it's the final telegraph radio message that the Titanic received, and it's the one that gave specific coordinates of the iceberg that tragically sank it, and it's the one where the radio operators responded with stop it, you're jamming me." A ponder point for all of us is how many warnings are ignored in our own organisations, and as analysts, how can we help create that consistency to avoid those organisational icebergs and to create outcomes that are better for our organisations and our communities as a whole. And with that, I will thank you.
Thanks very much, Adrian. Guys, we're going to do a couple of prizes at the moment. I believe Adrian has numbers. You have the books. Here's the prizes. So, Adrian, you've got 2 numbers.
Yes, I do. So the first number is number 17.
So who's number 17?
T-shirt.
So, Adrian, you'll have to sign this when you come to South Africa.
Oh, it would be my pleasure.
Okay, and our second prize? Number?
Is number 47.
Number 47.
Sunay Scooter.
Awesome, well done.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This is Adrian.
So we're gonna take a short break now, and then we're gonna go and do a little bit of a panel discussion. So Adrian, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in September. As a matter of interest, how many people here are going to come to conference? Quite a few. So you'll see all these faces at conference, and we look forward to it. So thanks very much, Adrian.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for inviting me. It was really fun to take part.